Our Executive Director, Chris O'Keefe.
How's everybody doing? Yeah. Just a real quick question. How many of you folks are going to be attending the marijuana seminar coming up in a couple of days here? Just show of hands. The only reason I'm asking, I don't care. We're not judging here. I just need to know how many bags of potato chips we need to stock up on at Meridian's. Those guys are trouble, and it takes a crew that's special to keep an eye on them. Before I get started too far, Laurel shared some comments to me about this community, and I'd like her to take 10 seconds to repeat what she told me.
So out of all the places that we graze for the many, many years that Lee has been grazing, all the way from the Bay Area, San Francisco, all the way up to the mountains, I tell people over and over when I see them on the trails, when we're working here in the spring, I can't tell you, it's at least a dozen times a day that Sun City Lincoln Hills is the most well-managed place that we have, a homeowners association community that we have seen, from your open space to your landscaping to the many activities you have. And for the homeowners association fee that you pay, I can't tell you, you're in a great place. And most people, I think, know that, but sometimes people need a reminder.
Thank you. I'm just going to delve really quickly in how we got here. Anybody here last year at the seminar we did? Give you the background, and then we'll let Lee take it. Next photo, please. Next slide. There it is. I found this picture a couple of years ago on the Lincoln Messenger site. It's a little fuzzy, but it's a beautiful shot of the interaction of man and animals. You got the peaceful grazing herd in the background and the wonderful relationship with the dog, and I think that that's absolutely spectacular. Next slide, please. So how did we get here? Literally, back in 2007, I was standing out in the middle of a field off of Ingram with Sarah Sweet, who was the biologist for Restoration Resources at the time, and she pointed out the fact that the association needed to act to reduce thatch in the open space. What is thatch? It is the accumulation of biomass, plant life that becomes fuel and creates problems if we have a fire. And so we talked about a couple of things. One of the things that we could have done was a controlled burn out here. I don't think that you folks would particularly be interested in that. The other thing that we could have done was to march through the open spaces with staff, with string trimmers. And I don't think that the wildlife would have liked that a whole lot. Chemical methods could have been used, but nobody's really in favor of any of that. And so I was reminded in a past life that the old Arco Arena, if you recall that, back in the day, it was surrounded by fields, and they would come in with herds and they would graze it off around that facility. And so I asked Sarah if we could do that, and she looked at me and she thought, well, let me look into it. And so I believe you know Morgan, don't you, Lee? We got in touch with Morgan Duran, who's studied this over a number of years. Got with Pat Shea and Riley Swift, who were working in our open spaces. Riley helped to build a lot of the open space infrastructure out there back in the day. And we just started working the plan. Next slide. So we started researching in 2007 and 2008. Sarah helped us put together a grazing plan along with Pat Shea. We submitted that in 2008 to the grazing, to the Corps of Engineers. And then we had to find somebody to do this because it really hadn't been done in an area like we have here at Sun City Lincoln Hills, where you've got homes in proximity to the open space like we do. We've got 487 acres of open space out here, so it's a big job. And we had to find somebody that we were comfortable handling that, because we knew that if something went wrong from the get-go, it would really put a crimp on the operation. So we did a trial run in 2008, did about 90 acres, and Pat introduced me to Lee Hazeltine. And that was the start of a beautiful friendship. I feel like Bogey at the end of Casablanca, with Louis walking off into the fog there, kind of. Lee got it from the time he came out here. he understood that it just wasn't a job, but he had to build relationships. He had to build relationships with the association and its staff, because initially we had to support the effort to a little bit. Anybody remember holding the fences back in the day to let the sheep cross the street? Did anybody actually do that in the crowd? Wasn't that a blast? There were a lot of exciting times in those first 2 or 3 years. And if we didn't have somebody of Lee's quality helping us to get through that, we would not have succeeded. Next slide. So, 2018, when I put this slide together, well, it's 11 years that I've known you. It's hard to believe. Time flies. We currently graze about 270 acres. Since we've started this, you see the other communities around us that are now following in our footsteps. We were the pathfinders for doing this type of operation. It's been done in other places. I read a number of studies about some military bases down in Southern California area where they would do this, but nothing in proximity to the homes. So that's pretty special. When you graze out here, it's not just about the fuel management and this and that, it's about the interactions, again, with staff and with residents. And I know that on a almost daily basis when Lee is out here, it's either Lee or somebody from his crew that interacts with our residents who live on the open space or who are just walking up and down the trails. And he has built up so many positive relationships with our residents that that's something that we should really be proud of. Our vendors aren't just vendors. Our electrician isn't just our electrician, he's part of the family. And Lee's been a part of the family for 11 years. We love him, and we're going to bring him up here and tell you how he keeps those rascals together. So, Lee, take it over.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much for coming out this afternoon, and especially Paula. Paula was, I don't know if you know who Paula Horsley is? Yes. Thank you. Thank you. When I came to work, she told me, I'm retiring this year. And my first thought was, oh, crap. But she found a great replacement in Willie, and it's working well. And so I'm so glad to see you. Thank you all for coming out on a hot July day. As I worked this year grazing and would share with people what I was working on now, I realized that there was more to tell from what we did last year. Last year was our maiden voyage doing this forum, and in that forum we tried to help you to understand how the grazing comes about. Because when you come out and you see animals and you see fences, you don't always understand how it works. So we talked about rattlesnakes and dogs and all kinds of basic things. And that kind of, not only was that good for me, trying to speak in a way to share with you, it was good for you to understand what I'm up against so that when you see me walking around and I don't necessarily look like I know what I'm doing, I'm trying. So, I got into the grazing business in 2006, and I need to tell you the story to put it into perspective. Prior to that, and actually up until 2008, from 1994 through 2007, I was a labor contractor. I ran men with equipment and chemicals and machines. I was mainly in forestry, and my biggest customer was Sierra Pacific Industries, who has the mill right outside of town. I worked on several of their tracts of land, and I was one of their better vendors, contracting vendors. One of my bosses nicknamed me Dr. Death because my job was to kill brush. So along with that, on the home front, my kids were growing up and they got involved with animals in 4-H. And so when you have all these animals and they get names, they tend to multiply and never leave. And I remember one time adding up how much the menagerie cost, how much my lifestyle cost, and it was $5,000 to pay for the feed for all these animals that were just pets. When we bought the property, I built a little barn, and immediately, boom, it's too small. It was a 20 by 40 barn, so then I put a wing on it, it's still too small. So then I built a 5,000 square foot barn and thought, that'll show them. Within 12 months, you leave it to, you give people something to free reign, they'll fill it up. I think I finally got ahead of it when I built the last barn that was 18,000 square feet, a third of an acre. That one doesn't fill up or down. So we had all these animals, and along the way, the kids got involved in showing and grazing, and not grazing, but judging and things like that. My oldest daughter, Sarah, is a carded American Dairy Goat Association judge. She can judge dairy goats, travels all over the United States, and judges goat shows. They also formed a little judging team back in the day in 4-H for meat goats. And in that, we developed relationships and contacts with people in Texas. So I actually know one of the 6 families that brought the very first boar goats into the United States in 1997. And there's a whole story there. But what I was looking at as a contractor, all of a sudden, about 2004, 2005, I was out way out in this tract of land. And there was a plantation that we had sprayed the brush in 5 years before, and it was full of brush. And I said to the forester, why don't you let us spray that while we're here? That way it'll be efficient. And he goes, nope, can't do it. And we got into an argument. I said, we're driving all the way out here for a half day's worth of work in this one plantation. We can make a full day's work. To me, that seemed logical. I'm trying to make my services functional and economically justifiable so that they will pay me. And he's just, boom, no. There was a reason. And I'll get to that hopefully somewhere in this whole thing. But it had to do with the economics of timber production. So when you drive through the woods, a lot of that brush, it's there because we don't have an economically viable way to manage it. And so I thought, I wonder if I can put the goats in there cheap enough to eat the brush, to get rid of the brush, so that everybody would win. And that thought was the beginning thought that brings us all the way to where we are today. It's been a long time. So in the fall of 2005, I was feeling fairly affluent. I was 41 years old. On my quarterly numbers, I pushed all my numbers, and I was a paper millionaire. For the first time ever, when I added up everything I thought I had and everything that everybody else thought I owed them for, the difference was $1 million. I thought, wow, this is cool. So then I decided to get crazy and try this goat thing. So in 2006, I bought 700 goats, took 2 of my best workers and turned them into goat wranglers. And we took that herd of 700 goats to a tract of timberland, an 800-acre tract, for 100 days. And I made the deal with the company that they wouldn't pay me a dime. All I asked for was the ability to use those 2 men if anytime they didn't need to be working actively on the goats, that they could do something for the company. And so we would cut limbs out of the road that would hit trucks, little maintenance things. And we nicknamed the job the nickels and dimes. It was basically a time and motion study, and we figured out what our cost was to run that single herd with 2 guys for those 100 days. Within that, I took an extension agent from the UC to work about 30 days after I started. And we went out into the woods, and we're wandering around, and he's taking pictures like the one Chris started with, really cool pictures and brush. And we're looking at all this brush, and it's starting to regrow. And he said, if you bring those animals back and time it right, you can really knock the snot out of this brush. Now remember, I was Dr. Death. That was my job, was to kill brush. That was my whole motivation as a worker, was to get paid to kill brush. And I'm looking at this regrowth, and I'm thinking, man, that's some really good-looking feed. And I'm having all of a sudden everything's going weird internally. I looked at Glenn and I said, Glenn, I don't want to kill it. I want to figure out how to make it pay. I want to figure out how to turn that into feed for my critters. And so we rapidly, really quick, back and forth emails if we could put the animals in the environment in a way that the animals thrived and prospered and kept the brush from accumulating to catastrophic levels, it could work. Now, we've done it. We know it works. We're doing it, and it's working. But do you know today, 2019, we still can't quite get the greater population to embrace the idea because it's still a lot of abstract stuff inside of my head and other people's heads that we're trying to figure these things out. To get people to see what we're talking about, we have to show them. Well, to show them costs money. Now, this is where Sun City is really, really cool. My relationship with Patrick Shea predates Sun City. He used to be an entomologist for the Forest Service, was a peer of my father's. They argued all the time on two sides. My dad ran a public health agency, was pro-chemical. That's probably why I was a chemical applicator. Patrick was more on the environmental side, was at Cal during, the genesis of the environmental movement, the Clean Water Act and all that. My first conversation with Patrick Shea almost didn't survive the day. We went to the woods and we're driving down the road to go look at this thing, and I said something about my dad such and such and such and such, and he said, "Bill Hazeltine is your father?" And I said, "Yeah." He stopped. "Get out of my truck." I said, "What the hell?" He said, "I've had more arguments about things with your dad." Patrick's Irish. Go figure. Anyway, we got past that. We were great friends. We did some great things. Come forward 10 and a half years to 2008. I'm in the Bel Air Market in Woodland, California, and I see Patrick in the distance. I haven't seen him for years. And I walk over and I bump him and, "Oh, excuse me, sir." And he rears around like he's going to hit me. And then he said, "Oh," it's this great reconnecting moment. I said, "What are you doing these days?" He said, "I've retired from the Forest Service. I'm in charge of this conservancy group that's growing like crazy. What are you doing?" 2008, the housing market is on its ear. I've just shut down my spray business because there's not enough work to sustain it. We went from a lot of houses to very few, right? Remember those years, bad economic circumstances. I said, "I'm trying to figure out how to survive and make a living running sheep and goats." "Oh my God, we've got to talk." He starts telling me about this thing called Sun City over in Lincoln, which I haven't really paid attention to for years and years. And they bring me over, and the first thing I see is all of your houses with no back fences. And I'm like, ooh, this is really scary stuff. When I get into my talk, you'll see a slide, and I'll show you why. I mean, I was running my animals where I didn't have to deal with people. You get that one? It's not good having lots of bosses. So then I was trying to figure out how to get out of it. And Chris kept pushing on me, "Get over here, we do this." I kept making excuses, and finally he bluffed me. He said, "At least do a prototype run." He alluded to that, the demo project in the fall of 2008. We unloaded 640 animals on October 8, 2008, and it took off. You guys did a demo project of 90 acres. In 3.5 years, I kept adding on other stuff and figuring out how to do other pieces and parts. And I got lucky. Some guys that I knew needed feed. In 2011 to 2012, in 3.5 years, we took the program from 22 acres up at the top of Spring Valley, which is where we started in your neighborhood, to 5,000 acres and 14,500 animals on the first day of May. That's a lot of critters. 6 ownerships. So now I'm hurting my men who are hurting my animals, and I'm also hurting the owners who employ other men and their animals. And since then, in 10 years, it's radically evolved. And parts of it I struggled with. I'll be the first to admit that. The City of Lincoln is now operated by one of the entities that is a combination of 2 entities that I brought in to help me. I don't make any money out of that work anymore. For a long time, I didn't like that. I'm a work in progress, as we all are. I now can say to you, I'm glad they're here. We need more people. I've gotten over myself a bit on that, and it's growing. It's getting bigger. What I would like to talk to you today is about a lot of stuff that I've learned in just the last year since I spoke with you about grazing. So with that, we're going to get right into the slides. This slide right here, the upper left-hand corner, that is part of the levee system for the Yolo County bypass. You drive on it on Interstate 80 or I-5 when you cross over that long bridge. That's where I used to be. How many houses do you see? Hardly any. The upper, that's 2009, 2010 work out in Winters in the upper right-hand corner, Vineyard and Orchard. How many houses do you see? 0. I liked that. That was work I did when Chris was asking if I knew Morgan Doran. We actually they produced a paper and were kind enough to put me on as a co-author on a white paper. We called it a white paper. It was about grazing in the vineyards because I'm an Aggie. This is the rest of the photo is a landscape around houses. So we work in urban suburban environments. We work in conservation lands. I do a lot of work in farming systems, both conventional and organic. I've got a lot going on right now in the organics. It's plenty to keep you occupied. One of your new residents that moved here in December from San Diego, they were playing cards, so I went to see what kind of card game they were playing. And they said, "What do you do in the off season?" I said, "Well, in a perfect world, there isn't much off season because off season, if you're not working, you're not making money. You're not getting paid. So I'm trying to increase the amount of off season because I'm trying to work less." Again, I'm a work in progress. Can I have the next slide? I came up with this slide. Who's feeding who? A lot of people that don't understand what I do here will come up to me and say, "Why are we paying you to eat our free feed?" It's a very good question. Who's feeding who? So we figured out how to do this with the 2 blue arrows. You see it's a circle. The land and the plants that live in the soil feed the animals, but the animals also feed the soil. And that's a big thing in our science, in our carbon sequestration, and our holistic management, and our restorative agriculture. We've lived as a culture being able to kind of shortcut the thing and do things within our soil systems that are starting to struggle and in some places fail. And we're trying to get back to some level of function for our benefit. So a lot of what I've done in the last 10 years here is trying to figure out how to work within your environments, with your soils, with your stuff, that also takes care of my animals. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, that was, I think I'm really good at talking, but a lot of times I don't get stuff from here to you. And so part of my challenge today is to make sure no matter what I say that you hear what I need you to hear. So keep that in mind when you get to questions. Can I have the next one? Okay. Lots of times people want to know how many animals or how much do they eat. And so I used to always rattle into the math. Numbers. I'm a numbers person. Each animal consumes 5% of their body weight in dry matter per day. Yeah, okay. So what? The total consumption for Lincoln Hills is the amount per day multiplied by the number of grazing days. Yeah, okay. So then the next line, the third one, is the formula. 0.05, blah, 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 blah. Okay, now, then right below that is the math for how many tons of dry matter my animals ate from your open space this year. 450 dry tons. Okay, now, by dumb luck, I've had a really lucky year. I'm involved in another project, so I'm going to ask the same question with a visual on the next slide, so hit it. How much do they eat? By dumb luck, that pile of silage right there is 450 dry tons. And then the next slide, I'm going to show you the video of the things working just to kind of give you touchy-feely stuff. So, Lori, if you can turn those on while I'm talking without the sound. We had this figured out at home on the laptop. So the machine in the left-hand picture, the center machine is a silage chopper. It's $500,000 for that one machine. that entity owns about 10 of those trucks that are $40,000 or $50,000 a piece. They come in, they go across the digital scale to weigh, they put it on the pile. You'll see the right-hand video going. That tractor goes back and forth and packs it down. You're familiar with the term silage from feedlots, dairies, livestock operations, things like that. This is production from 250 acres of land that I am subleasing from my good friend Ed Sills. It's part of a 500-acre tract at the end of Catlett Road. In the background is the Feather River, just over the levee. The reason we made silage is because we had so much seepage from the river that it kind of screwed up the alfalfa and the grass and other things that was full of weeds that was not going to make very good hay. So we green chopped it. You see the machine coming closer and closer and blowing it in the truck? So now I have enough feed to feed my herds, all of my animals, for 60 days that I'm going to start hopefully feeding in about 10 days from that pile back onto those fields to feed those fields, right? Remember who feeds who? The interesting thing is it took me 60 days with about $500,000 worth of livestock to eat your 450 tons. That $1 million worth of equipment made the equivalent amount of feed in 3 days. Chopped it, three days, pop, it's there, it's done, fast. It'll probably take me way longer than 60 days to feed it all, trying to get my money back. But I'm doing it because I believe that is part of the solution, that we've got to figure out how to move carbon and life forms into the soil through the critters, because we can't just do it with machinery and other things. Was that of any interest? Was that kind of fun to watch? A little bit of entertainment? Years ago, Chris and I were at a meeting in Rockland when Rockland was trying to decide whether to graze, and their guest speaker was a little boutique grazer that had about 50 head of sheep and goats, and he charged people so much per animal, so much per fence, so much per visit, and his cost structure was like $1,500 an acre. But the key thing, Chris remembers it, I remember it. He said in his talk, he said, never underestimate the value of entertainment. Just ask Hollywood. Remember that? And so Chris and I, we recognize that if we do our job well and it's pleasing to you as residents, that if you accept us and you enjoy watching, that really helps you guys to tolerate our presence within your community when the animals make noise at night or, get there. One of the things I started doing last year was, we call it enhanced grazing. She's gonna run this. This is kind of fun. So what you're going to see is down the bottom of the picture, I try to zoom in on it. You may not be able to see it right down there. There's actually some almond hulls. You see the little bits and pieces on the ground. I got real close to it. We were putting almond hulls down. And what we were doing is we were adding 10% almond hulls to the diet in an alfalfa field to feed 650 pairs, 1,300 sheep. So you see the mamas and the babies. So you see I started with just a few, and then you see it's one big old long line. And what that did is it changed their diet. So instead of having a high protein diet, which was just alfalfa, it put energy and other things in. It helped, it managed the risk for bloat for my critters. We also now believe that does cool stuff for the soil. And I'm really fortunate. My new friend, Nicole Tauchis in the front row, she runs the research farm at Davis, the sustainable farm. And she came over. We may take parts of this presentation and cut and paste it for an audio clip to put on the campus radio. Nicole gets to work with soils and look at what happens below ground and how activities above ground influence all the life forms below ground, the microbes, the fungi, the bacteria, and all those things. So we've sampled 8 different fields where we grazed and left some ungrazed. And we've got a really cool data set. We don't really know what it means, but we see difference. So we know something's going on. So it's kind of cutting edge stuff. This is enhanced 2.0. We started out putting 10% almond hulls. We were shoveling out of the back of a pickup with snow shovels. Pretty funny, huh? So one day, this field has a ditch that runs through it on a diagonal, so the paddocks aren't the same size. And so I told my men, put half of your pickup load in the first set and put the rest in the second set. And I came back, and there were no tire tracks in the second set. Where'd you put the almond hulls? Oh, we put it on the first set. I didn't have this face. I'm like, oh, crap. So I started to get angry because I'm an educated guy, right? I'm an Aggie. So then I thought, maybe this is one of my chances to get lucky. What am I supposed to learn? So what they had done was double the rate from 10% to 20%, 200 pounds per acre. And I thought, okay, what the hell? Call the truck up, say, bring me a load of hulls. So we brought 25 tons of hulls in, and we dropped them in the bottom edge of the field where the equipment runs back and forth and there's very little production. That's in Yolo County, just north of Davis. That's Road 27 going one way, and in the background is Road 102. That set right there, those critters are eating more hulls than hay. On that truck, he's got this really cool digital scale, and so he drives along, and I'm watching. I put so many, I just kept putting each set. I'm going to put more and more feed. Do those animals look happy? They're doing well. We had a really wet winter. That paddock from there back to 102, where we put those extra hulls, even when it was raining like crazy and the water was standing in the field, those paddocks were greener than the rest of the field. The plants looked better. There's just something about it. We don't understand quite why it works, but something is happening. I got this off the internet, and if you see, the plant on the left is a legume, it fixes nitrogen. The one on the right is grass. It eats nitrogen. We call that a symbiont relationship. Just like your soils feed my critters feed your soil and improve the soil function and keep your water cleaner and healthier. Within the plant system, the plants do a bunch of stuff below ground that we're just now starting to grasp and understand. You see how those roots are kind of going back and forth? Those root systems are linked by mycorrhizal fungi, and they have a whole economy. It's like a community below ground, like the baker and the butcher, cabinet maker, right? Everybody's got a job to do, and everybody trades with what they have. And so there are people who do entire talks. If you guys are interested at all, a lady does a really good job. She's out of Australia. Her name is Christine Jones. So if you Google soil, the liquid carbon pathway, or Christine Jones, she's lots of talks, and she puts up great slides how all these plants interact. And so that's what's happening below ground most of the time. We're now trying to figure out how can we put our animals in those systems in ways that help that work better. Better is relative, right? It's a work in progress. Next slide. We do all that so that we don't have things like this. Does anybody happen to want to guess which fire this was? Campfire. Do you see Lake Concow in the upper right-hand corner? Lake Concow is I grew up in Oroville. For 13 years, the road that I'm standing on when I take this picture with that power line in the background, that was my biggest client, the one that I talked about, SPI, timber. I drove the rim road. That's where my crews went to work every day for 13 years. And so we used to drive through this. It burned 10 years ago in 2008. We couldn't get up in elevation late in March because it was too muddy, too wet. I was trying to get to show Laura where I used to do all this spray work. We couldn't get to the timberland, but I can tell you that all the planted trees after the first fire from 10 years ago, they all burned in this fire. So not only did the town of Paradise get hammered, the community of Concow got hammered. When we were coming back down, mobile homes, cars, it's a wipeout. And it's because we're not managing the system to scale. It wouldn't have mattered if you'd have had a half a mile fire break on this fire, because behind me, the canyon that the fire came out of is so steep. When you have that much fuel, you can't stop it. And one of the things that drives me in all of this work comes from the first and second year. In 2006, I put those 700 goats in the woods for 100 days. In 2007, I took my boss and his 2 foresters that I would go to work for on this road, and I took them over and I showed them the work. And Jack Bean was the forester then, and he got it. I said, it's a little rough, but look at the fuel. Look at the difference in the fuel profile. He took the message back to a manager meeting with his boss, the owner of Sierra Pacific Industries. And in every business meeting, there was an opportunity, just like we'll have Q&A at the end, there's a point in there when he'd say, any new business. And Jack said, my vendor is getting into this goat thing, and I've been to see his work, and I think we should consider doing this. At the time, Red Emerson asked a very good question. He said, cattlemen pay me for the privilege of putting their animals upon my land. Why should I do this? Now, I've since, in 10 years of figuring this out, we were unable to sustain the dialogue because the question was not, hey, Jack, you're a really smart guy and you're one of my better, you're a good boss. Help me to understand this. He said it the way I said it. Why the hell should we do that? Boom, toxic. None of the other foresters 10 years later will say, whew, nobody's going to touch you with that because the boss has spoken. My mistake is instead of figuring out how to re-engage the conversation, I got angry because I felt like I had been dismissed and not taken seriously. So I basically said, screw him. If he's not smart enough to take care of his own land, let it burn. I regret that I had that attitude. It was a bad attitude to have. Because look at the cost to everybody else. We have got to figure this stuff out. We have a lot of work to do. So coming back, go to the next slide. Coming back, I'm now, quote unquote, semi-retired, trying to spend more time using the education and the accumulation of experience to move things forward. I still have to work enough to pay the bills. So that slide right there cost me $1,000. The guy on the left is a consultant. $2,000 for a day of that man's time. I paid half of it. Ed Sills, the farmer, paid for the other half. That's Roger Savory. If you've heard of Alan Savory, who's the kind of the guru of holistic grazing, that's his son Roger. And we spent a day, and he challenged me with a bunch of things. Within that, we were looking at a whole bunch of things. I'm going to look at this screen. Improved soil function, elevated biomass and carbon, right? We elevate those things in the soil. When we do that, I want to say correctly, but correctly is a subjective term. There are ways to do it that actually improve soil function so that more water falling from the sky absorbs into the soil and doesn't run off. That's one of the things that I've done within your landscape pretty effectively. You have less water running off and running out to the ocean, that it resides within the soil a bit longer. That's why it grows more grass and more things now than when we started. It's more functional. If we transfer that across the whole landscape, timber included, we'll have less problems with bug trees from disease because there's more available moisture later in the year. So the big picture bullet point says we want to slow down the movement of water from sky to sea. And we have to do that by paying attention to our soil function. When we do that, we get increased tonnage production. We get improved plant interactions, what we call flora quality, and the natural processes improve. The plants feed the insects feed all the animals, birds, all the things you have, rabbits. It's all there, and it's all part of this big web. Next slide. I put these up. We'll go back to a little math. When I started with Chris, he was saying, we got to do something because Sarah's saying that if we don't, we're going to fail. And what happens in conservation law is the only thing you can't do is not pass the class. It's pass-fail. There are no Phi Beta Kappa awards. There's no excellence awards. So we figured out that it took 8 years for the system being what Roger Savory calls over-rested, not grazed, not operated. We thought that the diminishment in soil activity, which is the purple line, and I apologize for being a little squiggly, I was doing that freehand on the computer. And that's why the yellow line that should be pretty straight is even squiggly. And that was after about 5 times of trying. The yellow line represents the gradual accumulation of dead thatchy material above that you see. That was the indicator that Sarah was using as an indicator that we had a problem. We thought that it fell below baseline after 7 or 8 years. Next slide. What we've come to understand from our monitoring plots that are over by 12 Bridges Elementary School is that it actually falls. So the top line is my hand-drawn thing that I then made the graph from. The bottom one is more realistic. It actually falls off rather quickly. So in just 2 or 3 years, so what we did, starting way back in 2008, Chris was in on this, Pat was on this, we put these stakes in the ground 16 feet square, and we made these exclusion plots. So we have a plot out there that has not been grazed for 18 years. We had another one that we let them graze and then fenced it and watched to see what happened. So it's been 10 years. It doesn't look much different today at year 10 than it did at year 3. And that was the clue that the plant systems actually, when you stop, it's just like our human health. If you live most of your life with a healthy lifestyle and stop, we tend to diminish much more rapidly than we would like. You get that one? It's a lot of work to sustain our physical self. And the older we get, the harder it gets. So the second one was, okay, we find that the thatch is doing one thing, but the soil function is actually doing something else. Okay, next slide. Well, the federal government came up with this great idea that says, okay, we know we got a potential for a problem in all these conservation easements, and we have to describe it. When the government puts out a written document to describe things, they usually describe the least amount of work necessary, the bare minimum. Speed limits are maximum, but functionality is in minimum. What's the bare minimum requirement? And so the next graph is my attempt to try and show what happens if you graze every 3 years. The federal government came up with this idea that says if you graze your conservation easement 1 year out of 3, we'll give you a pass. We'll figure that's sustaining it enough to keep it from failing. But it's a bare minimum. That's just a bare minimum. So with the original assumption that it was fading gradually, which is the upper block, grazing 1 every 3 years looks pretty good. But what happens when it falls off really quickly, which we think we know to be happening? It's much different. You see, the function is below the line. The soil function is below the line, even though the thatch doesn't look like it. Next slide. This one is really hard. So in trying to figure out what was happening with our grazing activities and put it to articulate it into a narrative that hopefully you can understand. If we just come in and graze, the plant system year by year between the wet season and the dry season goes up and down. So all you need to take from the 2 upper squares is it's up and down, and it assumes that it's constant. It's a good assumption to make, but not necessarily true. If we start with a system and we start grazing in this lower square, the lower left-hand square, it's falling down in the summertime when nothing's happening. The soil activity is going down because it's drying out, and we have a very long drought period. It's starting to rise up, the plant's starting to grow. We graze it, knocks it down, and by doing that, we start to stimulate the system. And so you see the line is starting to lift, but it still has a big spread between the high and the low. That's a single graze pass activity. That's mostly what you see everywhere. Grazing 1 time. The next graph, the last one, was my attempt to try and come up with a basis for a model which shows when we, in the intergrazing model, when we time it right, and especially with a 2-pass system, where we start working within that natural cycle, a better balance between grazing and growth and rainfall and soil function. The key thing you want to note is in the one in the lower left-hand corner, both lines went up. So the low end and the high end, there's a little bar there, 2 little bars, and they're about the same. When you go to my curve on the right-hand side, do you see how the bottom line, how much higher it is? That's a key concept. The whole system is rising, but not only is it rising, but we're also, as we improve soil function and water retention, that retained water and more carbon allows the fungi and the bacteria and the microbes to better get through the summer to the next event so that they don't fall off as far. Okay? Now, again, 2019 is a lucky year. Do you remember how much rain we had and how long it lasted? You can go out in your open spaces and see green in the middle of July, which is not normal. That's the argument for the value of that longer period of soil moisture. In our natural environment, it doesn't happen that often, but it just, dumb luck, it happens to be happening in 2019. That because that moisture kept replenishing, our drought cycle is smaller. I would submit to you as a group, which I will say as adults. I said that to 6th graders. I would submit to you. And they all looked at me. And off in the sideline, Laura says, 6th grade level, Lee, 6th grade level. I would submit to you. Oh, yeah, 6th grade level. I believe. Do you get what I just did? The I would submit to you is kind of a way to say something that politicians where they use a bunch of words but don't commit themselves. I would submit to you. What the hell? Right? If I say I believe, now I'm standing in the middle of it. I am invested in it. I believe that if we manage our soils more proactively, it's going to take a lot of work. We're going to make mistakes. We've got to allow ourselves to make mistakes so that the word fail isn't negative. It's actually the acronym that Laura likes, the first attempt in learning, that we can then elevate our soil function so that we have more moisture in our soil profile, more life living from year to year. Cleans up our water. We'll have more water for our crops, more water to drink. We'll have less dust. We'll have less fire. It's a key deal. So, now, all of that had to do just with the interaction between soils and animals. Years ago, I started coming up with this idea of intergrazing, which is what I try to do. So now the equation went from 2 parts, right? Plants and animals, who feeds who, to 3 parts. What did I just do by adding the people? I made my job a whole lot harder. Not just a little, right? What's the trickiest, most complicated thing to successfully do? Keep the people happy, right? It's the hardest. People are fickle. So we put people in, and then it got weird. And so the idea behind the intergrazing model is trying to keep everybody happy, including me, and the people, you, the people. Okay, next slide. Within that, Chris kind of stole some of my thunder, and I'm glad he did. Success factors, strong relationships. We're able to try stuff, do things, work on stuff, collaboration and planning. Hey, I want to do this because, and if the relationships are strong, we don't necessarily have to understand each other to trust that they're doing the best they can. We have to have trust, and trust is hard in human relationships. In-depth knowledge. The reason I'm walking around, the reason I'm still involved, you have to be involved. You can't manage from the armchair. You've got to be out there seeing what's happening. So we watch the animals, we watch the weather, we watch the plants. We're constantly adjusting our game. In 2019 and 2018, we came later because it was so wet, and that's not normal. We usually come earlier. Systematic review of daily operations. We're usually, by the end of the first week, all of our plans completely shot. We literally, you have to be comfortable living with adversity and change and be adaptive. My guys that work for me, that have worked here for years, know how the sets work. We have to be flexible, as I said, and the historical knowledge, which I've already said. One of the things I did different in 2019, you may have noticed, for years we used to sleep the animals in the center portions of the open space where the water runs. Because of my interest in soil function and my belief that we need to have more carbon and carbon life forms and more cycling of nutrients in the drier portions, I flipped it. And so we slept the animals more between the walking paths and the houses. So if they kept you awake by being outside your back door, I apologize. It was harder for me because I had to provide water for them above the path. Normally when we moved them, we used to put them up in the morning, get their morning feed, put them back. They drink from your creeks, and that's where they stay. So that was easier on Lee. But what was that doing? It was taking that carbon resource from the upper elevations and moving it down next to the water, which I used to think was what we were supposed to do. I now think we're supposed to take that from the wetter areas that are stronger and better, let the big kid carry the little kid instead of the little kid carrying the big kid. So now we're trying to move some of that stuff higher up the hill so that when water falls, right, that soil then can hold on to more. And I don't know if I'm right. Time will tell. I'm guessing. Educated guess. We'll see. Next slide. This slide, I wanted to talk about minimums, maximums, and optimization. For years, I used to talk about my little triangle and my hand would be going. I used to say integrating is about optimization of all the parts rather than the maximization of any single part. Earlier, you heard me talk about minimum standards. Minimums and maximums are subjective, and it all depends on your point of view. So I have 3 examples. One is wages. Minimum wage. You guys are writing the check to the association that pays me. So your motivation is to write a small check. Human nature. You want what you want, paying as little as possible. I'm over here as a vendor working real hard. I want to earn all I can for my work. So we're on opposite sides of that. We have to meet in the middle. Fire safety. Your fire safety standards are bare minimum standards. They talk about so many feet off structure, this and that, fuel height, all this stuff because of the expense of it. What we showed back in '07 was if we change the whole system and manage the whole system, it's a whole different paradigm. We no longer have to worry about whether our so-called fire break works or not because we've changed the game. The third one has to do with grazing. Most of the grazing that you see happening is happening and being driven by decision makers, by economics, by convenience. So we wait until late in the game so that we can come one time, blah, 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 blah. When I started this with Chris, when I got almost done and I was starting to figure out that what I thought I was figuring out that I'm trying to talk to you about today, in those days the idea was he was going to have me come in once every 3 years and fix your thatch problem. And we had a price divided by 3 that made the budget work, and I went to him and I said, hey, this is not good biology. This is business, but it's not good biology. I said, if I could get my animals through your system every year for 15 to 20% more, doing it every year rather than once in 3 and giving you a much better product, could you absorb it? Now remember, Chris wasn't the executive director then. He was my boss then. And what did I say about wages? I'm wanting to do more work. We worked that for years. I was always wanting more, and he was always wanting to pay less. And I was, it's been like that. But thankfully, we've made it work. Now, why and how? Next slide. Why are the animals important? Think about that one for a second. I've talked about all this science and all that stuff, but the animals are key to the success of this thing for some very basic reasons. When I started grazing the 22-acre site in 2008, Chris wanted me on the sidewalk to talk to anybody that wanted to ask me questions. It was a kick the tires sales job to see whether it would work for you guys. A guy came up in a nice car. He was dressed, had his hair combed just right. He got out and he started chatting me up. His wife was standing by the car. She was very kind, had a very sweet smile. And we got to talking, and he asked me, "Are you making any money?" I kind of gave him the wise-ass response. I said, "Define making money." I've since learned that in debate, to answer a question with a question is the most aggressive form of debate known. And especially when you're speaking to your elders, when they ask you a question, you're supposed to answer it not with a question, but anyway. And he looked at me like, what kind of a smart aleck are you? And I thought, oh, great, okay, what do I do now? I kind of knew what I was doing. I said, okay, imagine your buddy starts a company. Think back to Steve Jobs and Apple, right? Started in a garage. They're onto something, but nobody really knows what it is, and so they're all scrimping and scratching. Imagine you can tie yourself onto that, and you're not going to make any money in your paycheck, but you can buy stock in the company, and you believe the company is going to grow. Would you take the job? And so the guy says, and what I said was, would you take a position in a company that's going to pay you barely enough money, cash money to live, but it's going to double every 2.5 years in value? Would you take and you can buy all the stock you want. Would you take the job? And the guy goes, absolutely. Next question. He said, so, you think you'll keep grazing in Sun City? And I had been coached by Chris to be very careful about what I said because I never knew who I was talking to. And I said, well, that's really going to be up to the board. And the lady by the car went, eek! And the guy went with this look. And I went, are you a board member? And he goes, yes, I'm Peter Bridges, my wife Lois. That was 10 years ago. You never know who you're talking to. The animals were the key because when we successfully care for the animals and put them into your systems, not just as worker grazers coming in as adults and eating your weeds and leaving, you think that and I do, I manipulate it. I bring my babies, right, so you see babies and you see all that, and it makes it fun. But what you're seeing is that we've combined the ability of animals to reproduce themselves. A lot of grazers run adult animals and they don't breed them. They strictly graze for hire. They're like a bunch of single males with no familial attachment. They're hard workers, but there's no expansion. The increase in animal numbers so that I have animals to sell for food is what balances the budget between what you guys want to pay and what I want to make. You get that one? That's why the animals are important, because when we manage them well, now there's room to negotiate. Okay? See what I put on the next slide. See, I'm not even looking at my stuff. Now, here's where I go off topic. Where do we go from here? This leads into, and holy smokes, I'm right straight up, 3 o'clock. It's Q&A time. Before we go to Q&A, I want to talk to my slide a little bit. So what I've done in the last 1.5 years is I've gone back and made efforts to reconnect back to UC Davis, where I went to school. And Nicole was nice enough to come, so if you guys want to ask soils kinds of questions, she's really smart at that. I can talk about animals. The little guy in the lower left-hand corner, that's all right. I'm a pioneer. I've always lived outside the curve. I've always been trying things, and I've been fortunate enough to have survived. History is written by the pioneers who lived to get home to tell the story. So far, I'm still standing. What we think we know today after all these years, it's a lot, but it's really just the tip of the iceberg. We've got a lot of work to do, and it's getting really complex. And there's times when we really don't know, and we have to be standing out there, supposedly smart people, and people are asking us questions that we can't answer. It's a little bit humbling. Okay? So I'm working more with soil systems and how all that stuff works, trying to tie it all together. When I was getting towards the end of your grazing project, I was thinking, wouldn't it be cool if I could bring that silage from Catlett Road and feed them to my critters here and increase the carbon and be able to show an increased soil retention and blah, 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 blah. Do you think the 13,000 people who live within Sun City are really that? No. Most of us, when it comes down to it, we don't want the details. We don't want, I almost said something inappropriate. That's a lot of work. A lot of work to make all that happen. We have to simplify it down. So I have to ask you guys for your trust that I actually think I know what I'm doing, and I'm going to do my very best not to screw it up. And you're going to say, okay, we'll try to not get mad at you when we think you're screwing it up, and keep working at it. So I believe in the future that we're going to do more with the animals within the system. One of the things that I have proposed to the Wildlife Heritage Foundation, you saw Patrick Shea, it's actually a different director now and a different biologist, but we're in discussions where we're talking about putting some sampling plots about 100 feet in diameter in a bunch of places, including Sun City, where we might exclude the animals in certain 100-foot circles, and in others where we might pin them at night. So we're going to try and look at what happens when we take the material and remove it, and in others where we increase it, and see if the soil sampling and the lab analysis that Nicole does, see if we can start to tie together how the animals affect the soils. So if in the future you see a plot, and if it happens to be close to your house, and it doesn't get grazed, don't yell at my men, okay? We'll try to make it so that you know, yeah, that's an exclusion plot. Well, why couldn't you put it over there? Right? Not in my backyard. So this, I kind of bombed Chris with that because we haven't had a chance to talk about it. I actually talked about it on another WHF project that I'm working right now over in Loomis. This is a cool concept. Nicole has said if we get it up to about 100 feet, you know, we can sample within that and try to get good data. This is exciting stuff. This is really cool stuff. So with that was what I wanted to get you guys to hear a year later from the first presentation. That it's not just about rattlesnakes, dogs, lambs, goats, touchy-feely, when are the grandkids coming and all that. We're actually really heavily involved in trying to understand and derive solutions for our children and their children. So, questions? Let Paul get a microphone and roll with it.
Thank you. You have a mic? You have a mic? Great. Over there.
Yes, thank you.
You didn't mention anything about selling the wool that they produce. Do you do that?
So the sheep that I run, that I have bred and developed, are not wool sheep. To get that multicolor, they're actually a blend of wool and hair sheep. They're meat sheep. So when we shear them, it's a mixture of wool and hair, and it has no value to the textile industry. We actually throw it away. So for us, the shearing is a cost liability. Now we do use some sheep, and I brought 760 yearling sheep, and they grazed parts of my stuff. I don't know if, were the wool sheep in Sun City? No, they were in Cota Vadera, sorry. So we do use some, but we haven't used them in Sun City in quite a while. Does that answer your question? Yes. Okay.
Okay, right down here, I think I saw
Yeah.
gentleman. Whoop, turn his mic on.
Turn his mic on.
How do you get
We have 1,000-gallon tanks, 500-gallon tanks. We own about a dozen individual troughs. We have float troughs. One of the things that allowed us to provide you a better value was because of the flowing water in most of your open spaces. That, again, it's dumb luck. The conservation law is derived off of the Clean Water Act, going all the way back to Nixon. Clean Water Act. So all of these houses that have streets and runoff, it goes into the box culverts and they drain out. They did a beautiful job of engineering those so that they don't just run down the hillside with a big gully. They actually have a pipe that goes down into a primary basin. Most of your drainages have clean flowing water when we have the animals there. Some of them do not. The spot where we started in '08 at the top of Spring Valley, there is, if you can't see it because you're not supposed to walk out there, but when you're near the top and you see that little green thing down at the bottom, it's like a little pond, and they can drink out of that. This year, because we subdivided that, we actually had to supply them with water. If necessary, we do it as a cost. We try to work off of water that's there because we believe that the animals function better when they drink from natural flowing water than strictly out of the trough.
Lee, is there any reason why you use both sheep and goats?
Yes. For the purposes of this talk, I didn't say anything about that. Thank you for reminding me of that. When I started out, I only had goats. I added sheep because when I went to Texas in 2007 to buy more goats, and I was out on Warren and Darla Cood's ranch in West Texas, out of Fort Stockton, way off the paved road, I was going to buy his goats. And he asked me, how come you're not running any of these Dorper sheep? And I said, ooh, Warren, it's some pretty tough country out there. That brush is pretty tough. He said, why do you think I'm selling you the goats? Now, usually when someone from West Texas is trying to sell something, it's healthy to be a bit skeptical. You get what I'm saying? All of a sudden it dawns on me, he's so confident in the sheep's ability on his own ranch that he's letting the goats go. So, when he got all the goats in and tallied them up and he gave me a number, he didn't have enough to fill the truck. It was a $5,300 freight bill to run 1,700 miles from his ranch to where we were going to unload them. You don't want the truck not to be full. I said, you got to put some sheep in there to fill that truck. So I bought 125 ewe lambs and 25 wether lambs. I stuck them in a prune orchard near where that first photo was and started adjusting my attitude really quickly. The sheep are easier to run. They have a different kind of personality. They have a different behavior. When I showed up and was just going to bring sheep, Patrick says, you can't do that. I've told everybody you're going to have goats. Chris included, you got to bring some goats. Do I have to? I don't want to. So the first herd was 570 sheep and 70 goats, roughly 10% and 90%. That herd walked around for 18 months, never going on a truck. Dumb luck again. We put them down in the McBean Park expansion and grazed, and we found that we didn't get into trouble with all the bushes. You've seen a lot of tree and bush damage along Ferrari Ranch Parkway when they've tried to run pure goats. They're learning. They'll get there. We were just lucky. We had 10% goats. So about the time the goats are going to get into trouble with the brush, the sheep have eaten all the grass off the ground. It's time to move. So I came up with a way to explain that. I said, if you want to keep 3 boys honest, put them in a bus that's filled with girls everywhere else. Those boys aren't going to do a thing. Right? There's a logic to it. So we came up with this whole thing about brush species versus grass species. So we use both because they behave differently. They eat differently. They have different desires. Goats like to get up on their hind legs. They're much more curious. They'll run all over the whole set before they decide what they're going to eat. Try walking a herd that's half sheep and half goats 4 miles down a levee. The goats will get to the end and back twice before the sheep get there. I know this because on Halloween in 2008, I walked a mixed herd 4 miles on the levee. That levee that I showed you in the first slide, that was where I was getting to from another place. And thank God we had water on both sides, and we had a fence at the far end. And one guy, I said, okay, just stay with the goats. Within 10 minutes, they were gone out of sight. Which is why in 2012, when it was getting really crazy and I had 14,500 animals walking around, I took all my goats and I put them down in the delta because it was just one stress that I didn't want. I brought them back into the herds in 2019. We're bringing them back, right? We're comfortable enough. We've downsized. We're not so big. We're comfortable. Because when the goats get loose, they can make a whole lot of mischief really, really fast. Chris and I have a few stories about that. They've really challenged our ability to be friends. Yes.
I was just wondering, I saw a lot of lambing happening.
Yes.
Is there an advantage to having a herd that's having all their babies while they're grazing with you?
It's a lot more work. In the fall of 2014, I had this harebrained idea that I would start breeding more. Instead of breeding my animals to have babies once a year on a 12-month cycle, it takes them 5 months to make a baby. And so I had this idea that if I could breed more quickly and stop trying to make twins and just be happy with singles, that I could get the same number of babies and have, because when I'm grazing, a mama with twins has to watch 2 babies, right? And so the stresses go up. And then when people walking by with their dogs or whatever, it all adds into this whole big pot of things. So what you see in 2019 was the year when a portion of my animals were bred completely wrong for logical purposes. And I needed every single animal to get the work done because we had so much rain and so much food. And so we put little pairs in places where we could run them, and we put the big kids where the little ones couldn't go, and then we let them lamb. And so we actually got a whole lot more work done for you guys that I didn't have to charge for because I was able to bring everything. So it's more work. The city of Rockland, if you look at their grazing document that they've rewritten, they specifically say in their document, no pregnant animals allowed. They don't want their people to have to make an interpretive judgment about the joy of birth versus, oh my God, my child just saw a baby born. They deem it to be unpleasant enough that they have prohibited it. I'm glad that you guys like them enough that you let me do it.
Okay, go ahead.
I read,
Yes,
yeah. I understand that in open prairie days,
yes.
large ruminants were important just because of the hoof action.
Absolutely.
To maintain the soil.
Yes.
These smaller sheep, is that significant here?
I believe so. If you look at our history, the bison was equivalent to the cow, the buffalo, antelope. Large herds of antelope that moved, bighorn sheep. We had smaller ruminants, we had both, right? You get more, the bigger ones, they churn more. The little ones do more. They all have a place. We don't really understand how all that works. I believe that what we saw in the Great Plains was you saw the buffalo replaced by the cow, and you saw the antelope and deer in our culture replaced by the sheep and goats. Right? We took wild animals that didn't want to pay attention to where we thought our property lines and our gardens were, and we replaced them with domesticated animals that we think we like better. Right? We like the deer until they eat our roses or tomorrow's meal. Does that sort of kind of answer that? But that herd effect, in the wild, they had to come together for safety. And so that creates concentration. That's part of the holistic model, is that the animals need to keep moving. It's a high amount of activity for a short period of time. We try to mimic that by keeping them within the sets for 1 to 3 days in the really big herds. I changed that a bit. If you saw where we were lambing and things like that, obviously we didn't move them. We made a bigger set and we kind of left them alone. But the main herds were moving frequently. Come in, eat it, get gone. And that's part of the logic of that. We don't have to understand it to trust that nature knew it was supposed to happen. I think, hang on one second. Yes. That one's not on. Hang on.
I am
There you go.
curious about the meat.
What about
is
the
it,
meat?
when you sell it, is it considered to be organic? And
No.
how old are the animals when you sell them, and where do they go? Do they go overseas?
Let me try to answer that as best I can. I can't certify those organic or animals to be organically produced because I can't guarantee that every food input was not somehow affected by a synthetic compound. Okay? I'm pretty comfortable that my animals are healthy for a whole bunch of other reasons because they get a wide range of diets. The forages that they consume, that broader forage, the secondary, that's a whole nother piece of science I didn't even talk about. If you want a great book, it's called Nourishment. The guy who wrote it is named Fred Provenza. It's been out for about 6 months. He spent 30 years studying animals at Utah State, 75 graduate students, 200 scientific papers. The guy's just an amazing individual, understanding. And towards the end of his career, he started figuring out how plants and animals, how animals self-regulate their consumption of different things according to their need. So we believe that the meat from the sale of our animals is actually healthier food as compared to a linear diet, say in a feedlot, where you have very few choices of food. I sell all of my animals to a guy that I've worked with all these years. Every Monday morning at the plant in Superior, the animals are harvested. They're harvested under USDA stamp. They go to the customers. I don't know what I'm going to do when Jim stops by my lambs. I've entertained the idea of direct marketing, but that's like a whole nother order of magnitude of work that I can't even wrap my head around, right? Relative to trying to take care of the herds and the ranges. So that when I tend to sell lambs at 80 to 90 pounds because that's the customer base that we sell to. They want whole carcass lambs. That also kind of matches with the New Zealanders and Australians' idea of the perfect lamb, a 20-kilo carcass, 44 pounds. Smaller. When you buy New Zealand lamb chops at Costco, and you notice they're not very big, that's about a 40 to 45-pound carcass, which is an 80 to 90-pound lamb. So that's typical weight that we sell. They're usually a year or less. They can't be older than a year, or they're not considered lamb. We can still sell them, but they go to a different market. So we try to raise the boys up and get them to weight efficiently. We're not worried about time. We're worried about all the other stuff, right? They go when they're ready. Did that answer the question well enough? Okay. Yes.
In a shepherd with
Yes.
a rifle in case of
No.
coyotes or wolves?
No. In more primitive environments, more rural environments, we could. The dogs, we sort of live with it. In 2012, I went back to the same tract of land that I started with in 06 with a much larger herd to try and restart that forestry stuff. And we were having predation losses, 3 and 4 every morning to mountain lions. And I just thought I thought I had to live with that. You know, I live in California. You self-employed people have to take all the abuse. You know, you don't have rights. Everybody else has got entitlements, not the worker. So the dogs, we didn't shoot them. There we actually got involved with the federal trapper who came out and took the mountain lion that was killing our stock. Right, there's a whole process for that. No, we don't run, we're not allowed to have, right? There are ordinances because we are in Lincoln or Rockland or wherever. In order to have, even if I wanted, because I looked into it for that purpose, if I have a problem, in order for me to carry that weapon, I have to have a concealed carry permit. Livestock producers are allowed to do that, to have a rifle in your pickup. It's just not worth the trouble. So we manage it with our animals, and it's a deterrent effect. Our guardian dogs pee and poop around the perimeter. The fences shock and are hot enough. We haven't had in Sun City a single predator loss in 11 years. We've lost animals other places, more rural environments where the critters are a little more aggressive, a little more hostile environments like I described in 2012. But in Sun City, we have not had a predator loss. That's pretty amazing. Yeah.
Do we have any further questions? Oh, there's one right there. Whoop, hang on. Wait for the microphone, please.
Wait for the microphone.
I want to hear about the rattlesnakes because I didn't get
Well,
to come last year.
So okay, so give me some liberty there. We did some rattlesnake work this year for Mr. Drake over by the Catholic Church. It was a piece that was not really convenient to graze, and Chris put it on the top of the list because Mr. Drake was making it very important that he was not happy with the rattlesnakes that were coming out of the open space to his yard. So we grazed it very hard to get rid of the cover that rattlesnakes like to live in. I don't know if we've changed anything about how many rattlesnakes showed up on Mr. Drake's porch or garage or whatever. I don't know that. But he asked. It was within our power to provide, so we did it. When we were moving the animals in there, the morning we were moving them in there, from the Ingram Slough going around behind, on Oak Tree Lane, we're pushing them down the road, and all of a sudden my guy jumps sideways. Ooh, tremenda cascabel. You know what I just said, right? Great big rattlesnake was hiding under a rock. So we're over there with our shovel and our stick. We're trying to get him. Right? The herd's long gone. We're on a mission to try and get the snake. I think what you're seeing happening over there by the Catholic Church is that the county property, the 57 acres that the county owns where the old Nike missile silo bunkers are, I think that's where most of your snakes are coming from. And they're coming down into that little piece by Mr. Drake's house because you've got water and food. And so we try to graze off the cover and change the food dynamic so that the snakes aren't as, right, take away their opportunity to forage, they're going to be less inclined to visit. Yes. Yes. We've lost a few in Loomis this year, unfortunately. It happens. We've had a few in Sun City. It happens every once in a while. Generally speaking, you can kind of tell when there's a rattlesnake in the set. The herd will be moving along, and then all of a sudden the hole will open up because the snake will buzz, and it's wired into their head. Oop, back up. The rattlesnakes are not inherently aggressive. They seem that way when they're pissed off, when they're cornered, when we're trying to catch them or do something to them. But in general, they don't want to fool with us any more than we want them to. So usually, when the ground is vibrating from all the feet of all the critters, they're getting out of Dodge. They're looking for a hole. And if we just, so usually that hole will open up. Most of the time when we get a snake bite, it's on the face, and it's because the snake is surprised. The critter is happily munching along, and they have an unfortunate encounter. It happens. I mean, it happens in all, right? Those unhappy surprises that happen to all of us from time to time. It's not a very big number. We live with it. I think we got a question in the back. Yeah. Did that answer your question enough about the snakes? Haven't had a problem with any of my dogs. I had one get bit. I saved it. $1,500 worth of vet bills. Yeah. Yeah, we do vaccinate. We do actually pay the money for the vaccine. Question. Nope.
Not on.
Somehow you got to figure out what button to
Ladies, don't
push.
turn them off.
I'm not sure.
There you go. Yeah.
Your timing of when you lay that cloth down, but have you ever added earthworms to the equation?
Absolutely, and dung beetles. Go on the internet and try to find somebody who will talk to you about dung beetles here in Placer County at a knowledge level that we can put them to work. I've tried. I mean, my father was an entomologist. The reason I have this hat is a $130,000 hat. When my dad died in '94, we started a memorial scholarship fund. My dad was a public health entomologist like Pat Shea. And we have an endowment that provides graduate assistance to graduate students in research in public health entomology. So I grew up knowing, scientific names for bugs and things like that, right? I grew up in an educated household. My dad had a PhD in entomology. The earthworms are huge. Laura and I were just talking last night where we grazed over in Meridian this year. They did, as part of a conservation innovation grant with federal funds, they were looking at no-till, grazing, or conventional for corn. And in the latest update, the farmer says, yeah, where we chopped and incorporated the cover crop, we found a lot more earthworms than where we no-tilled or where we grazed. So on the face of it, that suggests that chopping and incorporating is actually better, because when we humans stick a shovel in the top 6 inches, we catch a bunch of earthworms sneaking a meal. I said to Laura, I think we're missing something. I got a hunch that when we disturb the environment by chopping and incorporating, that we tempt those earthworms up into the upper profile. Just because you get them or don't get them in the shovel doesn't mean they are or aren't there. I think we need to be very, very careful about how we interpret what we see. And the classic example is when you go out in your open space, you only see what's from the ground line up. And you either like it or don't. When it's that tall, you don't like it. When it's down short, you like it. End of discussion. But what's going on below the soil is much more critically important. And that's one of the things I've started saying with Nicole, and we're not sure that we're right. I say what we humans do with what's above the ground line is much less important than what we humans do that affects things below the ground line, including earthworms. Did that answer your question well enough? Yeah.
Do we have any further questions? Yes, there's a couple of them. There's one down here.
Talk louder.
When an animal gets bit,
Yes.
how do you handle it? How do you take care of the animal? Do you,
We keep them quiet.
yeah,
If it's a dog, we take them to the vet. If it's a sheep, we oftentimes have to put it down. Yeah. In the early years,
but they don't suffer any longer than they have to?
we
if you-
try to, now, and to answer that question, the obvious answer is we try to do our very best with every animal. I have a saying, I always bring my A game, you may not always like it. One of the things that Laura and I learned was, if I'm out there working and I'm doing anything, it's oftentimes interpreted as that big meanie. So if I'm handling an animal or something like that, the perception is much different. If I go out to pick up an animal to take it out of the set for any reason, what's that big ugly guy doing? If Laura's out there, hey, get out there and give her a hand. Right? I mean, it's that basic that it has to do with how we interpret because I'm big and I'm male. So oftentimes it's assumed that I can't be sensitive, yet if the guy that I've done years of therapy work were here, he could tell you most definitely that I have a very high sensitivity. And I am very, very, very susceptible to the perception of not being heard or seen, which contributes to my, when I go aloof, when I feel like I'm rejected. So it's counterintuitive. I'm big, and yet I'm extremely sensitive, but I have a system to run. So it's not what we want to do, it's what we need to do, what we have to do. And so that's one of those things that's kind of a constant compromise. Every maternally minded person wants that to be done right now, to minimize suffering, stress, all those things. And we tend to sometimes get into a struggle with that. So all I can do is to tell you I'm doing the very best I can day in, day out. And if we're a little slow getting there, I'm sorry. If we gave every sheep a human tender, it wouldn't work. So within the system, we're always improving, we're always innovating, trying to come up with better ways to do it. And part of that is these healthier environments that are more functional. They will raise and sustain healthier animals generally. Yeah.
We have a question down here.
Yeah.
Yes, my question's along the same lines.
Yes.
Sheep versus goats. I
Yes.
live on the open space, and it's very steep by
Yes.
my house.
Where's that?
So on Glenbrook.
Okay.
Okay, so we saw lots of lambs, and
Yes.
I would say maybe half of them were limping
Yes.
and lame.
And
And
that's
so that
nothing
was
to
just
do-
heart-wrenching,
Absolutely.
of course, for everybody it would be.
Yes.
And so I was wondering,
Yes.
because I totally for the whole program,
Yeah.
could it be goats on those steep rocky slopes rather than
No.
sheep?
No. So I was thinking I was going to have the very first presentation ever when I wasn't going to get a question about limping, and I was thinking I was going to get to have an extra celebratory beer later. It's okay. 2019 was a butt kicker year. When you see them limping, they have fungus between their toes, and it has to do with the moisture, which is why most people won't keep their herds in these locations. Most of the sheep herds, commercial sheep herds, are south. San Joaquin, Mojave, San Diego, Texas, dry environments. Even in the Intermountain region, it's a dry cold. It might be 10 below, but it's dry cold. The fungus in the foot causes them to limp. We struggled mightily this year trying to keep up with the limping. What happened starting about January is it was so wet all the time that we would put them in the corral and work feet, and it was kind of like you're basically just spinning your wheels. So we had to really struggle. It was hard on my herders. It's hard on me. An animal that's not running tip-top is not doing its best for me or you. We are still trimming feet even on those not limping. So I'm actually adding 2 more herders than I normally would at this time of year. I'm on a mission. September 1st, I want every single sheep and goat trimmed this year because I do not want another winter like last year. It cost me a lot of money. But it's money well spent. I'm not begrudging the money. It's just that you have to adjust your expectations against the year. We've had years when we actually have a supplement program that we started in 2015 where we put various byproducts, tomato, grape, coffee, tannin-based things, and a mineral supplement that's got iodine and zinc and other good stuff in it. We had great luck with that. You can't feed it to the critters when it's raining. Once that zinc level in there, what we found was if we could keep the zinc level up, that makes them safer against the fungus generally. It created a whole nother problem. It was working so well that we weren't noticing that the feet were getting longer, In the old days, anytime they were limping, you'd catch it, and the first thing you do is trim all the feet and then medicate. So because it was always there and there was always some level, it was sort of, it had a stable thing. The supplement, not only did it take away the fungus, but it also improved their conversion rate on their forage, which grew more feet. So we had some sheep this year that had toes that long. We had to use pruning shears to get the first part off. So yes, it's heartbreaking. When I walk out there and I've got limpers, we have to look at the body score. We have to say, yeah, she's limping, but how healthy is she everywhere else? So sometimes we have to accept what we don't want to accept and keep working. And we have to ask for your understanding too. Yeah. So when you noticed the limping, did you see different colors on the butts of the animals? Blue, green, red, yellow, usually on the butt? That's when we treat them, we mark them. So when people would say, man, there's a lot of limpers, and I say, yeah, but you see the red, green, blue, yellow paint? Those have all been doctored. We've actually looked at them. We're working on it. Yes, we're working. So we're only as, right, that comes into that thing where we have to accept that we're good enough to lay our head down at night, and yet at the same time we're never done, right? And live with that. Was that okay?
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Lee Hazeltine, who with his stuff has done a tremendous job for us today. It was very interesting stuff. Thank you, Lee. We'll look forward to next year.